The story of the old stone house begins, as far as the house is concerned, 1870, but it's not quite the beginning of the story of the Cracroft-Wilson connection. It was Sir John Cracroft-Wilson's structure built for the Indian and Eurasian servants he brought out with him from India.
The old man, as we all call him, is my great-great-grandfather, John Cracroft-Wilson, who was a very distinguished judge in India, and he was born there and he lived there all his life apart from his schooling. But he was getting near retirement age, and his first much loved wife had died of a fever, and he had married again, and he decided that he needed to look for somewhere for his retirement, and he'd heard about the settlement of Canterbury.
He had his eye on Christchurch itself as a centre maybe one day to retire to, and this is the finest piece of land he could find, was the hills immediately south of Christchurch, and the smack bang in the centre of the Port Hills, the Kashmir estate, which it came to be called.
John's mother was a Cracroft. It was a family that lived in Lincolnshire. The name then seemed to become handed down because every member of the family had the Christian name.
Lots of others are connected to the family too. Hackthorne Road, Wisby Road and Rossmore Terrace, Gun Crescent, Western Terrace is another one. These are all family names that the Cracroft-Wilsons have got through, on their own side or through marriage.
Cracroft-Wilson, of course, came from India, and Kashmir is just an alternative spelling of what we know now as Kashmir with a K and spelt rather differently. So he just adopted that name from his Indian experience.
Sir John's nickname was the Nabob. Nabob is a term to describe a princely, autocratic figure in Indian society, probably given to him because that was what he was like. He could be stern and autocratic and unflinching and dogmatic, a bit tyrannical even, and Nabob probably suited him. You forget the other side of him, of course. He's also extremely musical and genial, and he could be, and very hospitable. This is really why Kashmir is so important. It was the I would say in his time it was the social and the political and the entertainment centre of the whole of South Christchurch.
Well, when the Cracroft-Wilsons came here, of course, this was well outside the city. The city barely extended in those years beyond what we know as the Four Avenues today. So this was an entirely rural area.
Christchurch was quite a small little township, probably no more than 6,000 or 8,000 at the most living here. It's a rather special settlement though. It had been planned very carefully. It was meant to represent the best of English life rather than the worst. And I think Sir John would have fitted nicely into it. It was very interested in sport and culture right from the beginning. They'd no sooner had arrived, the settlers, than they were establishing newspapers and choral societies and little orchestras.
He arrived out here with his servants, and most of the animals died. One of the things in his diary, he notes down he successfully got the rabbits and hares out here, which really, being a farmer, I'm not very pleased about. So we don't skite about that aspect of it at all.
He had wanted to build his homestead up on the top of the hill looking down, but he found it too exposed and windy. So eventually he built his house, the first homestead, down by the stream, and built an extensive garden around it with beautiful rhododendrons, and it was very attractive.
The hills would have been mostly just tussock, and it would have been a lot swampier around here particularly than it is now.
He dug the drainage out by hand, and that formed the Kashmir stream.
The farm that Sir John operated here at Kashmir was in the end about 5,000 acres in extent, and it ran out onto the flat out as far as Sparks Road and Sutherland Road, and an extent round the hills that would have gone from Worsley's Spur right around to Huntsbury Hill, and then over the other side of the hills towards Governor's Bay. He had to share as a neighbour the Maori settlement at Rapaki, and he had a large stone wall built to separate his property from the Maori reserve. He didn't have a very happy relationship with the Maori there because they thought that all the hills should have been theirs. They kept on dismantling this rock wall and allowing their own stock to wander into his property.
He brought all his Indian families with him. They wouldn't be left behind, and so they had to be housed. And so this lovely old building was built for them.
We tend to think that 19th century New Zealand history is the story of the British coming and their interaction with the Maori, when in fact there's a much broader and richer stream of ethnic groups coming to New Zealand in the 19th century.
People say they were servants, but really they were more like part of his establishment that was, they didn't want to be left behind.
I think the accommodation in the old stone house is certainly better than the probably quite primitive warries that they were living in when they first arrived. It probably suited their style of communal living, where numbers of families would live together on a large estate and support each other and give each other company and the rest. But what the toughest thing was here was probably the weather. It was far too cold for them, and several died and others went back to India. Others got accustomed to the situation and the weather, and they stayed on, and their descendants are still in various parts of especially of North Canterbury.
The building itself is very interesting architecturally because it really has no parallel anywhere else in Christchurch, both the purpose for which it was built, to house a group of people living presumably in semi-communal conditions, but also architecturally the three gables along the front are quite unusual for Canterbury domestic architecture, certainly.
Nobody seems to know who designed it or anything, but it seemed to be modelled on farm workers' accommodation in part of England that he knew, Yorkshire. How much of the work was done by the Indian farm labourers, I don't know, but it's very skillfully put together.
John's eldest son, who came out here with him, who was a soldier but resigned his commission, his name was Frederick, and he married Sarah Westenra, who was another early Canterbury family, and their eldest son was John.
John Craycroft Wilson married Mildred Hall. And Mildred was the daughter of Sir John Hall, a very important premier in New Zealand history, because it was in his time that women received the vote in 1893. Mildred Hall is a very fine woman.
I remember my grandmother Mildred very well. She was a very strict lady, but fair, and she was a very strong supporter of Plunkett in New Zealand and the Girl Guides.
She was always chauffeur driven, and when we had camps she was chauffeur driven down to spend a few hours with us.
Sir John Craycroft Wilson's grandson, that's the John who was married to Mildred, he had a son, John Frederick Craycroft Wilson, and known as JF or as Freddie.
Freddie and Barbara were the owners of the Craycroft estate, very generous to our guide people.
My father was very keen on promoting those things that his mother had been keen about. I remember going to a guide camp there myself as a child, and he decided that it would be a good thing to do with the building, and gifted it to the Girl Guides Association.
It was on a Saturday, and every company in the district was there, and I think it was Lady Galway, the Governor's wife, Governor General's wife, who performed the opening.
The farm in my day was getting smaller and smaller as my father sold off land.
It was a very competent working farm. We had our own carpenter, we had dairy cows, and a team of draft horses.
The old stone house was always part of the farm complex, but by the time I'm remembering things, it was fairly derelict. It had hay stored in the basement.
It was just a stone building sitting at the end of the yards, rather sort of imposing, but it didn't register with me. I didn't think it was anything historic. It was just another old building of the farm.
When the war started, the military decided that they would find the Cashmere House and the buildings around a very suitable place for a military headquarters.
I can remember the day terribly well when all these men in uniforms, rather frightening, arrived to say that they had the right to commandeer the homestead and Old Stone House and Craycroft, the original homestead, and we were virtually given notice.
People might think it's draconian what happened around here, but it was war, and anything went.
While they were here, they built the caverns underneath Cashmere to be a safe place for their operations if the Japanese came closer. And that started from the cellar at the bottom of Cashmere House.
There was an entrance, I think, from the basement of Cashmere House down into caverns that were blasted out of solid rock, 100 feet down.
All the girders and all the steel trusses and everything went down a little railway from the drive, which came out from the big house just towards Hackthorne Road. It went down a little railway and taken down that way.
The local people, I don't think residents across the valley really knew what was going on. They managed to do it quite secretly.
And of course, all through the plantation there were barracks and a lot of things like that, which we weren't meant to see. But as a small boy, of course, I did.
We had a pass, I can suddenly remember. It was a piece of pink light card with our names on it, and there was a sentry at the top of the driveway outside Cashmere House. He had a little hut there, and if we wanted to go through to come to the farm, we had to show our pass to him.
The Hurst-Seeger homestead was quite a glorious affair. Photographs show it to be one of the finest homes to be constructed in Christchurch up to that point.
It was as important, for example, as Mona Vale or Daresbury over on Fendleton, and architecturally it was a very imposing building.
It was a large wooden house built largely of heart kauri, and it had extensive grounds, 5 acres of garden around it, with beautiful orchard and rose garden.
The drive to the old homestead is now all subdivided, of course, and it's called Bengal Drive, but it had the most handsome gates, which my 2 children seem to have in their garden. Somehow they've disappeared there.
Well, I remember the drawing room was huge, with lovely portraits on the wall.
The stairway went up, lovely staircase with beautiful balustrade. As children, if they had a party, we would look down through the railings and watch from upstairs.
Unfortunately, it got burnt down right near the end of the war when it was being occupied by the Combined Defence Force officers. Before they left the homestead, it mysteriously burnt down, and nobody's discovered why that should have been so.
There was very little left, although I do remember my mother found a box with a few oddments in it and an old part of an old silver bowl that had been stored in the cupboard under the stairs. When I first went to university, I became a member of the student Christian movement, and at that time they were already having an occasional meeting here in this building.
The student Christian movement was a very interesting organisation of international reach and importance. It was part of the World Student Christian Federation, sort of the New Zealand branch.
It was probably strongest on the student and the movement than the Christian in many ways, but it was, the action was coming from a base of trying to right wrongs and look at how society could be improved.
We'd all gather at the town side of the university with on our bicycles always, with our sleeping bags and little boxes of food and our pyjamas, and we would bike across town to Old Stone House, which, as I said earlier, even then was still well out in the country and gave a distinctly rural feel. We approached the building always from Worsley's Road, and we came through a working farmyard.
There was one or maybe two students basically living there, and so they were bunked in fairly basic conditions. But it was lovely just because it was ours.
It consisted of one large wooden floor at ground level and another wooden floor about 11 or 12 feet higher than that.
We slept both on, as I remember, old kapok mattresses, but also there was still the farmyard out in front of the house, and so we would often just stuff palliasses with straw and sleep on them. The ghost story was part of the attraction of people coming out here, especially for newcomers to come out on the weekends. The story that we always had was that the body had been stuffed in the bread oven, which was still in the back of the building.
It would have been a huge oven like they make the pizzas nowadays, and they were supposed to have had a fight, two Indians, and obviously the body was popped in the back of the big fire.
Ever since then, there seems to have been weird happenings reported from time to time, strange faces appearing at windows, people appearing in old attire in various parts of the building at night.
They would take the groups down, would sit down there with candles and they'd embellish the story grotesquely, I'm sure. It was also always very sort of thrilling and titillating to be sitting down huddled in a group in that rather confined space where the bread oven was and having this gruesome tale told to us.
My father was very interested in these youth movements, and particularly in the student Christian movement, and made the building available to them, and eventually decided that they would be good people to look after it.
In the early 1960s, there had still been farmhands living in part of the building to which we didn't have access. But I do know that in about 1967 or 1968, there were serious discussions, and the Craycroft Wilsons decided that the sensible thing to do was to pass it over to the student Christian movement, which wanted to make the building into something which it hadn't really been up till then, which was a national centre for conferences and seminars and discussion.
Some of the old students who had been SCMers in their undergraduate days and were now professionals around Christchurch, they were now architects and engineers, and they contributed quite a bit to these first lot of plans. And the students then decided that they'd get in and do some hard work themselves.
They spent weekend retreats here, I believe, and did a lot of work to try and restore the building and make it habitable. And they had plans to continue with that until, unfortunately, they had a fire too. It seems as if Cashmere was doomed to have fires.
The fire that destroyed the Old Stone House, or practically did so in 1971, was a terrible catastrophe, really.
There were sparks coming out through the roof, and one could see that the wooden support of the slate roof was on fire.
The roof fell in, and that looked absolutely heartbreaking, the mess. And it was the after part of that was so sad. Nobody knew what to do.
Nobody's quite sure how the fire began. Possibly it was started by an unshielded light or candle that was burning in one of the upstairs rooms by somebody in the building at the time. But it was a terrible disaster for the whole student Christian movement and for the Cracroft-Wilson family.
It just looked a typical burnt out building, and to look at it now, it's just amazing that the walls are still standing.
The enthusiasm that had been built up in the late 1960s to turn this into a national centre for the student Christian movement, in a sense that was already starting to ebb, and the fire really just put the final nail in the coffin of that proposal.
In line with the spirit of the whole district and of the family, work almost immediately proceeded and trying to recover from all the loss and get the building restarted, revamped, restored, and back to where it had been. In the finish, it probably is back to better than it ever had been before.
After the fire, everybody a lot of people just gave up on it, really, and said, well, let's knock it down. There's another 3 or 4 houses that could be built in this area. And of course, Norman and Betty Roberts, who had been involved in the Students' Christian movement, were very keen for the building not to be demolished and retained, and they effectively formed a Cracroft Community Centre with the object of that being to restore the building for use as a community building.
Well, I think the people of Cashmere and Christchurch in a couple of 100 years' time, if we can make this building last, they'll